My name is Derek Welker, and today we're going to be talking about visualized scenes. Now, the premise of this is kind of what can you do better as regards to visualized scenes. And what I'm going to be talking about today is we're going to be going through an overview of everything that is into a scene. So what makes up a scene, everything that combines to create a scene. And we'll go through of all the different words and terminology and everything like that. So the first thing that I want to talk about today is, what is a visualized scene? So a visualized scene consists of an environment and a backplate. Now, when we talk about an environment and a backplate, they are different things. So an environment is like the image that's on the right. It's essentially a 3D sphere of one image that has like a ground and then everything else above it, which contains all of your lighting information, along with all of the background and stuff like that. Now, a backplate is a static 2D image that goes into the background that just kind of sits there. Now, if you have an environment like the one that's on the right, you don't actually need a backplate, but they typically have better resolution as far as rendering goes if you have a backplate. But let's talk about the differences between the two. Now, an environment is, like I was just talking about, a spherical photograph that contains a large range of brightness, but it also contains, a lot of information. But when we talk about it contains a large range of environment, or a large range of brightness, we typically are talking about an HDRI, or a high dynamic range image. Now, let's talk about what that actually means. Now, an HDRI, or a high dynamic range image, is typically a 32-bit image that stores lots of data about how bright different parts of the image are and can therefore be used to emit light realistically into a 3D scene. Now, when we talk about it has high dynamic range, that means it's got a lot of information about how bright things actually are so that it can realistically be used in a rendering. Now, if you take a look at this image that I got from adaptivesamples.com, it's a really great website, and they've got some really good information regarding this. So the link's up top if you want to go and take a look at that. But otherwise, this is a rendering that they used, and what you can see is, the lighting is very good, and the shadows underneath the object are very, very crisp, and you've got a lot of good shadows, and it's a good rendering. Now, next thing we're going to talk about is what happens if you use an LDR, or a low dynamic range environment. What happens is when you use a low dynamic range, there's not enough information in the image to capture the brightness or the intensity of that brightness enough to actually have it realistically, or to cast it realistically. So an LDR is a low dynamic range, and the example of that would be like a JPEG, a PNG, or something like that, and that's typically an 8-bit image instead of a 32-bit, so it doesn't capture as much information. And when you have an 8-bit image, the pixel value goes from 1 to 255. Now, when you're using something that's an HDR, you have much higher values as to what brightness can reach up to. So let's take an example of if you were to use like a JPEG environment or a low dynamic range environment. We've got the exact same rendering, but you can tell the overall brightness of the object isn't as good, the shadows cast underneath aren't as good, and just the quality of the rendering in general does not look realistic. So when you're using an environment, you always want to use an HDR, or something that has a lot of information regarding the brightness so that it can realistically emit that light into your 3D scene. Now, when we talk about HDR and HDRI, we kind of see them differently. So if you have like an iPhone, I know an iPhone has this setting because I have one, but there's an HDR setting on like an iPhone camera. So, one thing that I always ask is, what's the difference between an HDR and HDRI, or HDRI? And the difference is typically it's the difference between photography and CGI. So when we're talking about photography, we're talking about an HDR, and we're talking about CGI or renderings or anything like that, we're talking about an HDRI. And the reason why is when you're taking a picture with your camera, you're taking a picture at multiple different shutter speeds. But what happens is it takes those shutter speeds, maybe 4 or 5 images, and it tone maps it so that the light areas can make sure that everything's kind of in unison with the dark areas. But what happens is it does that. There's like a program in the camera or in the software, whatever you use, that is doing it, and it basically turns it out and spits it out as an 8-bit JPEG. So yes, it's an HDR image, but it's not an HDR, I guess, environment, because it's not a 32-bit image. It's using an HDR software to create that picture, but it ends up just being an 8-bit JPEG. So it's still technically a low dynamic range image when you're using it like on an iPhone. Now, where a traditional HDRI or HDRI environment has a lot more information, and it's typically like a .HDR format. So that's everything about environments and HDRs, and what we're going to do is in a little bit we'll get into actually talking about what an environment looks like and how you can go ahead and make your own. If you take a look at Adaptive Samples, they actually have a lot of information on actually creating your own HDRI, and that's what the link is at the top. So if you are a photography guru or a photography nut, go there, check it out, and you can always create your own HDRI to then use for Visualize. Now let's talk about backplates. So a backplate, like I kind of mentioned before, was a traditional static 2D image, and it's just used as the background. So it just throws in there, stays there, it's static, and it does not move with the model. So if you're moving your model around, it's not going to move. Now, if you have an HDRI or an HDR environment in Visualize, when you rotate your model, it will rotate with it, but a backplate will not. Right. It accepts many file formats. You know, it can use JPEGs, PNGs, TIFFs. There's a huge list of things. So pretty much any file format you have is going to be fine. Now, if it's a file format that can't be in or cannot be imported, you can typically just open it up in Paint and save it out as something else. I've used that in the past. It works fine for you know, fairly decent renderings. But if you want something else, you can obviously open it up in Photoshop or anything like that and save it out. And you can typically use any sort of physically photo or something that's manually created. So if you're creating something in Photoshop or After Effects or anything like that, you can use that for a background, or you can use like a physical photo. So if you're actually taking a photo of something, you can absolutely use that as a backplate just so it looks extremely realistic. So let's talk about the different rendering options that you have when it is terms for, or in regards to everything that includes your scene. So when we talk about your scene and your environment, let's talk about the different options that you have as far as, you know, rendering that out. So one of the first options is a standard versus custom environment. So you either have a standard environment that comes with Visualize that you would use, or you can actually create your own custom environment. A custom environment would have, you know, either custom lighting, or it would be a custom HDR that you create. So using like HDR Light Studio, you can create your own custom environment. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now next is you can use like a studio backplate. So just like a blank kind of studio, I guess white or black or something like that, backplate to use for a rendering. Now if you know me, you know I've used this example in the past for some of my other Visualize you know, webinars. But we've got this carving knife with just kind of a studio backplate. It's just a white backplate. It's got a floor. It's very, very basic. But for 90% of the things that we see, you know, a nice studio backplate works fine. Now we have an actual photo backplate. Now this is what is like if you go in and you take a physical photo and then you try and manipulate your model to that physical photo. Now this is a photo that I just grabbed off of like Google or something like that, and I just mapped the model that I was using to that actual photo, and it looks extremely realistic. Now the great thing about this is because you're using a physical or a real photo in the background, typically the model that you're using is going to look more realistic in that approach. And the great thing about this is you don't actually have to render the entire, I guess in this case, for example, a kitchen. You're only rendering your model and the backplate's just there. Now the last thing is in SOLIDWORKS you could actually model the surroundings. So you can actually go in and model everything that's in there. Now obviously rendering this is going to take a whole lot longer because you're rendering multiple different things, but you can certainly control everything that's going on with it. So if you guys have seen any of my previous webinars, you've probably seen this picture before. I have this, and it's a great example because it's something that I did. I took this carving knife that I had, grabbed some of those files from GrabCAD, and I built my own little, I guess, kitchen countertop with a backsplash on there and some outlets. And this is what gives you a photo that looks extremely realistic because you're actually controlling every part of the rendering. So those are the 4 different rendering options that you have, and I'm going to take you through each and every one of those. So I just want to show kind of the differences between the 3 here. So on the top right, you have basically your studio backplate. On the bottom, you've got your photo that you throw in the back, and then on the top left, that's your studio that you would create inside of SOLIDWORKS. So depending on what you're looking for, that's what you can get. So let's talk about agenda. Let's actually get in and start using Visualize. But before we do that, let's talk about what we're actually going to be running through today. So the first thing I'm going to show you is what is an HDR environment. We'll talk about what it is, how we can adjust it, and what's all included with it. And we'll talk about what it looks like with a backplate and without a backplate. Now, and then we'll talk about the different types of backplates. So when we talk about the backplates, we'll talk about what files can we use, how do we bring in ones that we've saved in, and anything like that. And then we're going to talk about the actual physical scenes. So what I'll do is I'll get into SOLIDWORKS, not Visualize, SOLIDWORKS, and I'll kind of finish up building my own little studio, and then we'll bring that into Visualize, and I'll show you how you can use that to kind of do exactly what you're looking for as far as rendering goes. So HDR environment, we'll take a look at what an HDR environment looks with and without a backplate. We'll go ahead and we'll add a light in. And this is essentially what a directional light might look like inside of Visualize. So I'll show you how to manipulate that light into getting it into the position that you want and anything like that. And then we'll actually talk about HDR Light Studio. All right, so let's go in and let's hop into Visualize and take a look. Now, I'm using this Homatro example. If you're familiar with any sort of SOLIDWORKS webinars or demo files, this is a great one that they do. Some great files to look at. But let's first talk about an HDR. So when we talk about this, right now this currently has a backplate. So if I rotate this around, what you'll notice is the backplate doesn't really change. Yes, the shadow changes just because we've got a light here. So let me go ahead and just delete this light. What you'll notice is the backplate stays there. Now, taking a look inside of our Scenes tab, you can see we've got 2 different environments here. So I've got just a Chrome Studio and then just some sort of demo studio here, and then I've got my backplate. Now, I can actually delete out this backplate, and it shows me basically some sort of kitchen environment. Now, this is a 3D atmosphere. Now, if I go over into my file libraries, we actually have drop downs for environments and plates. So in environments, this is where you show all the different environments that you have. Now, if I go to like a Route 66 one, this is a model that would be used, for outside working in like car crashes. So you typically see this in like on the side of a road. So using like a Route 66 example might be pretty good. What you'll notice is as I move my model around, it actually moves the environment. And like what I was talking about, the HDR environment you can use without a backplate, but typically when you look at this, the resolution of using it is not overly good. So we're going to want to use a backplate with this for the most part, right? But the great thing about this environment is not only used just for the background, it's used for the lighting scheme that's in here. So if I hop back over into like a Chrome Studio, so this studio here, what you'll notice is if I zoom out a little bit, this is what your 3D sphere looks like. But if we zoom back into our model, let's rotate this around, we've got the different actual lights that you can see. So taking a look up here in this little thumbnail, I know it's small, but there's 3 giant white lights. And we can see those white lights. So, right, I can see the one light here. As we rotate this around, here's another light. And then here's another light. So it is a giant sphere of our lights, but we can actually, the environment is what's used to house the lighting that's included in this. Now, if we throw a backplate over this, the lighting will still come from our environment. So even if we put on like a very, very dark backplate, the lighting that we're using is still going to come from our actual environment. So I'm going to throw on my Route 66 lighting, and we're going to change to a different plate. So in my different plates, we're going to take a look at some of these other things. So I've got some Route 66 plates. All right, what you'll notice is now when I rotate my model, nothing changes as far as the backplate goes. Now, another thing to note while we're talking about this is we've got the ability to toggle between local and our cloud library. So if I turn on the cloud, I have a lot more backplates, right? So I can go in and change the backplates that I'm working on and add more stuff in. So if I want to go into my studios, these ones I've all downloaded. So if you see a green check mark, that means you've downloaded that specific plate. So if I take a look at downtown, I haven't used either one of these. If I double click on it, it'll download and add in. So the moment you go to use it, it automatically downloads it. If you want to go back, you just toggle back over into your library that you already have downloaded and use those. So that was the specific difference between an environment used with and without a backplate. Now, let's talk about adding in a light. So if we go back over into our Scenes tab and just kind of click off in this black space, we have the ability to add a new light. Also, if we right-click in here, we have the ability to add a new light. Now, when we add a new light, it just throws a light in there by default. Now, when we click on it, we have the ability to adjust some parameters. So taking a look at this, we have either point or directional. I like to use a directional light because it's focused more on the center of the model. We have the brightness of it. So if it's not bright enough, you can certainly brighten it up. This is where you would adjust in very similar to like the studio. So if you want to bring down the brightness of the studio and bring up the brightness of the light, you can do that here. You can change the color of it by here, or you can take a look at the color temperature. So like a 6500 Kelvin is going to be a fairly white light. So you might want to drop that down to like 5000 K or 5K to get something a little bit more natural. But 6500 is going to give you a very, very white, perfectly white light. Now we have the ability to transform its position. So if I zoom out, I'm probably gonna have to zoom out quite a bit of ways to find my light. Now I want this to be right over the center of this. So I'm basically gonna zero this out. And what it's gonna do is it's gonna put it right dead smack in the center. So if we go back over to our light, I'm gonna bring this up in the Y just a little bit. So what you'll notice is now sitting over my light. So we can also manipulate it here. If we just like click and drag, we can move it in and out. So we can do these settings just by doing a click and drag like we can in any sort of visualize setting. But one thing to note is this is actually looking at the back of the model. I might want to move this over. So if I click on the light, go up into my object manipulation, I can go ahead and move where it's pointing. So if I'm going to move this over a little bit, I can manipulate where this light is actually looking at. And if I want to, I can move the light in general as well. So I can move this to be right over the center. So we can take a look at where the light is actually pointing by moving this, and you can kind of see it highlights on our model. If I zoom in a little bit, we'll probably get a better look at this. Right, so as I'm moving this back and forth, you can see the light changing on the model. We just want this to go straight down. And I might, manipulate this around a little bit, and then we can throw this into like an actual accurate render and keep working on this. So this is the difference between, an environment with and without a backplate and how we add in a light. Now, the only other thing I want to talk about is a software called HDR Light Studio. Now, this is an add-in to Visualize that needs to be purchased separately. But here's the thing. Lights and adding in lights is in Visualize Professional. So creating your own lighting scheme or lighting environment, you would use HDR Light Studio for. So when we talked about like this Chrome Studio here and bringing in those lights, if you have HDR Light Studio, you can actually create your own HDR environment using that software. And the great thing is it ties right directly into SOLIDWORKS Visualize. So you can actually like pick where you want the light to be on the model, and it will actually put a light in the environment specifically so that it will point directly on your model. My coworker Jesse Sprague did a great webinar on lighting and within Visualize, And I'll throw a little like link in our description or a little like highlight in this video here so that you can check that out if you want to know a little bit more about HDR Light Studio. Let's get back into our PowerPoint and let's move on to our next topic. So our next topic is backplates. So let's take a look at what happens when we want to add a backplate in, what happens when we want to import some old backplates, and how we can use it. Now, it's really as simple as just doing like a click and drag, and that's going to be about it. And then there is some options that we have inside of Visualize to manipulate the model to fit the plate so that we can have it look like it's directly within there. So let's hop back over into Visualize and take a look at this. Now, adding backplates, right? That's something that we can just do in our file libraries. We can just go to plates and select the plate we want. But if we want to use a plate that we haven't used before, or something that we found on like Google or something like that, you can just open up your Windows Explorer, just do a little click drag, and it will update, right? So you can see it changed the backplate. So you don't have to go into Visualize and import it into your library. You can literally just click and drag it in. Now, if you want to bring it into your library so it's always there, obviously that's going to be a different story. But if you just want to bring it in for this model, or if you're just testing plates, that's what I do. I typically just do a nice little quick drag until I find something that I'm really looking for, right? So that plate's there. We can kind of like move this off to the side, right? And I may have this look like it's laying on the ground or something like that. And then once we're here, we can render this guy out and we'll have a very nice image. Now that's talking about adding backplates and importing the saved backplates. Now the last thing I want to talk about is manipulating the model to fit the plate. So if we do a Control-G on our keyboard, it gives us a grid. And this grid is a grid of the model. And this is where we can kind of line it up with some lines that are in our actual model or in the plate. So if I want to look at the actual perspective of this, we can do something like this. If I want to line up the grid, it's a little bit more complicated than this. Let me show you a different example here. So when we're talking about the grid, I do have some other examples that work well. So like when I showed you an example of this image, so if we do a Control-G here, it gives us the grid. Now what I did is I kind of lined up this line with this line here, and this line with this line here, and it kind of gives us the model in the perspective that we're looking for. Now, also my coworker Jesse Sprague has a small little tech tip on actually fitting your model into an actual plate, and that's specifically the techniques that I use to kind of explain this a little bit. If you want to know a little bit more about that and how to use that, go ahead and check out that tech tip. It's a great tech tip. I actually learned how to do this from his tech tip, so definitely check it out. So getting back over and recapping, we talked about how we would go through and add a plate and how we would import our saved backplate from something that we might have grabbed from Google and how to manipulate the model to fit the plate. Now let's take a look at the SOLIDWORKS Studio, what I like to call. Right, so we're going to go into SOLIDWORKS itself and build a studio and import that directly within to Visualize. So we're going to build it in SOLIDWORKS, and I'll show you kind of how the best approach is to building this. We'll talk about how when we go into Visualize, how it's automatically going to update. And one thing is we just have more control over the model and what it looks like in our scene because we're using it like this. So let's hop back. Well, let's actually hop into SOLIDWORKS here. Now, I have kind of a model that I've already started working on. We've got a countertop, a backsplash, and I'm actually going to add in some lights here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a sketch up here, and it tells us we're actually not editing something. So let me go back in, let me edit this part, and now we'll start our sketch. Thank you, SOLIDWORKS, for helping me out here. So I'm just going to add in some circular lights here, and instead of me dimensioning this, I'm just going to go ahead and we're just going to do a fully defined sketch. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete these couple dimensions here, and we're just going to make all of these guys, or try and make all of these guys equal here. So Control select all three circles and say make equal. right? 360 seems to be a good number here. I'll just make this a little bit more pronounced. If I don't like this dimension, I'm going to certainly just copy this dimension over. I'm going to make this 500. And the great thing is I'll make this dimension equal to this dimension so that if we make any sort of adjustments, they'll update. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to do a split line into this face here. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply lights to these inside of Visualize, but I'm just creating a split line for this. Now, what I'm going to do is while I'm in this, I'm going to go ahead and just change some colors of these different bodies. Now, the great thing is when we're just making colors, or when we're applying colors here, all we have to do is apply different colors for things that we want to be the same. So in this case, this body is I'm just going to color randomly to be like pink or something, or magenta, right? And then these faces that I have here, I'm going to color to be something else, because we're going to use these to be to make light. So as long as they're different, that's all that matters when we're in Visualize, right? So once I'm done here, I'm going to go ahead and accept my changes. We're going to save this, save all. I'm going to save everything inside of my assembly. And now let's hop over into Visualize. I'm going to close down this model. I'm going to go ahead and open up the other one that I'm working on. Now when I open this up, it tells me, hey, look, you know, this project has been modified. Do you want to re-import? I say yes, and it brings in essentially the model that I have. Right? So all we might have to do is we might have to bring this entire model up for the floor. So it's actually part of this model is underneath the floor. So let me just grab this. We will grab the entire model here, and we're going to just move this up a little bit. Yep, there we go. So now that I have kind of these appearances prematurely applied, let's go ahead and change some settings here. So I'm going to go ahead and throw in a traditional background. I'm going to throw in an environment that I really like to use. And then let's take a look at some of our appearances. So when we're taking a look at some appearances, we might want to throw on maybe like some wood or something else that we might use for like a like marble or something like that. Now the great thing is if I don't really know where it is, I can certainly just apply or just search for my marble, find it there. All right? I can cancel out of it to go back, and now we can look to find something else. So as far as like a backsplash goes, this is typically where I might use like a brick of some sort. All right, now that we've got a model that's got our brick in here, now the only thing we need to do is we need to apply some sort of lights to those circles that we specified. So if we go into our appearances, we'll have to go to the emissives, and we can add just some traditional white lights or do some warm lights. So once I apply a warm light, you can see it changes to all of them. And now this is where we can go into our model, switch over into do like an accurate render, so those lights might actually do something. Now, if the lights aren't as bright as what you're looking for, that's typically when we can kind of bump up the brightness here into that traditional appearance. So I can click on warm light. You can see the brightness is only 2. You might want to adjust this to like 10 or something, and it's certainly going to brighten it up. All right. So you've seen what it looks like inside of SOLIDWORKS to go through and make a change and show how it updates. So let's hop back over and kind of just recap what we've covered here. So we've created a studio, we've showed how to build it, how to apply it, how to bring it into Visualize, and how to kind of make some changes to those so that you can kind of get something of what you're looking for. So let's recap. You know, we talked about an HDR environment with and without a backplate, how that works, what that looks like. We talked about HDR Light Studio very briefly. So if you want to go ahead and check Jesse's webinar out, go ahead and check that out. I showed you how to add a light, move the focus point, and something like that. Then we talked about the different types of backplates, what it looks like to bring in and manipulate the backplate and change that. Then we talked about a SOLIDWORKS physical scene, how to build it in SOLIDWORKS, how to go through and change in those split lines and anything like that. And then we talked about how it automatically updated within Visualize to then make that adjustment, right? So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them at this time. Thank you for watching another CAD Dimensions Lunch and Learn. And if you have any questions, let me know. My name's Derek Welker. If not, I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks, and have a good day.
Don't forget to check us out on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and our blog for more great content by clicking on the links in the description below.